So in part one, we were looking at Morris's description of a variety of methods for developing a concept of God. And he settled on what he called perfect being theology, not unique to him, clearly having its roots in Augustine and Anselm. But what he said was, look, what we should describe God as is the being with the greatest possible array of composable great-making properties. So here we want to flesh that out a little bit more and be clear about how this works to go ahead and apply it and see what God is like. So here we're actually going to do a little bit more theology instead of meta-theology. So what are great-making properties? Here is Morris's description. So I'm just quoting from his book, again, the book, Our Idea of God. And he says, great-making properties are any property, attribute, characteristic, or quality that endows its bearer with some measure of value, greatness, or metaphysical stature, regardless of external circumstances. So it's really important there, that phrase, regardless of external circumstances, thus the italics. So let's think about that a little bit more carefully. What he has in mind is intrinsic goodness. So intrinsic goodness is opposed to extrinsic goodness, and that has to do with external circumstances. So let's think about this a little bit. Extrinsic goodness might be, for example, staying dry. When you are lost in the mountains and it's 10 degrees outside, staying dry is good, right? But if your circumstances are different, if you want to swim or take a shower, you don't want to stay dry. So it varies according to external circumstances. Now, things or properties or actions we can call extrinsically good because they are good for something else. They're not a terminal point of goodness in itself. And that is what intrinsic properties are, though. So in contrast to extrinsic properties, intrinsic properties are endpoints, telos, right? These are endpoints in explanation of value. They're complete in the Aristotelian sense, right? Just when he was describing the greatest good for a human, and he described happiness, he described it as complete, a telos. And so great-making properties are intrinsic properties. They have value in themselves. Now, how do we identify these is the next question. And Morris is certainly not going to cover all the ground that's needed to be covered if you're going to talk about intuition. Of course, there are books written on this, but he says that we need to use our intuition to identify the great-making properties. So God is thought of as the sole possessor of composable great-making properties. We saw that at the end of part one. And then we have this question, well, what properties are there then? What are great-making properties? How do you identify them? And Morris says we identify them through intuition. We have to rely on intuition. And then he clarifies what that is. So this is not some mysterious faculty that we have. It's certainly not infallible. He says these are naturally formed beliefs. And then again, in order to be careful and clear here on what his idea is, I'm quoting once more, naturally formed beliefs whose acceptance does not derive entirely from linguistic definition. It's not from evidence entirely. It's not entirely from testimony, memory, inference, or sense perception. So it's something beyond these capacities that we have for forming beliefs. So that's what he has in mind for intuition. So it would help here if we had some examples. What kind of beliefs do we have that we don't get from definition or evidence or testimony or memory or inference or sense perception? Well, he gives a few examples. 2 + 2 = 4. he says, is a form of intuitive belief. Now, that's questionable about whether or not that's from definition, but clearly it's a little bit more than merely definition. We do have meaning underlying that we have an intuitive conclusion that we're drawing when we say 2 + 2 = 4. Or nothing could have color unless it's extended in space. Or the principle of non-contradiction. One cannot both affirm and deny the same proposition at the same time. Or it's morally wrong to torture an innocent person for amusement. These are the kinds of things Morris has in mind. We form these beliefs by intuition. We don't argue to these beliefs. We just have them. And they're not as a result of evidence. They're not as a result of remembering them. That's nothing to remember unless you're really Platonic about this. They're not as a result of inference, right? These are foundational types of beliefs, and they certainly aren't the kinds of things you get from sense perception. So these are the kinds of beliefs that he identifies as intuitive beliefs. And then he says, of course, we need to start with what seems to be true, these intuitive beliefs that we have. And again, should we instead start with what seems to be false? Of course not. And this is a methodology that is repeated by various analytic philosophers, and I think is a very good methodology, right? What are your alternatives anyway? Okay, so if we're doing perfect being theology, and we have these great making properties as an idea, intuitively, what does that mean? Well, Morris says that means God is conscious, right? Capable of awareness and thought. So we think it's better to be a conscious being than not being a conscious being. If you have a 2x4 that's not conscious, you can pound a nail through it. But a conscious being, you don't just want to randomly pound a nail through it. Of course. Intuitively, God is a free agent. Being a free agent, having a capacity to act freely, is of value. That is of a good. God is thoroughly benevolent. Now, that's kind of self-explanatory in terms of being a good being, right? Having unlimited knowledge and unlimited power. Now, of course, we could spend a lot of time on what that means, but intuitively, something like this makes sense. Being the creative source of everything else. Being necessarily existent and not contingent. Being something that cannot go out of existence, that must exist. Being ontologically independent. Being the kind of being that does not depend on anything else for its existence, whether to come into existence or to continue in existence. The kinds of, the opposite of humans, of course. We need others in order to come into existence. We need others in order to continue existence, and other things, at least in an environment, to continue to exist. God's not like that. God is ontologically independent. So we put all those together, and Morris now has an applied perfect being theology where he can say that God is a thoroughly benevolent, conscious, free agent with unlimited knowledge and power, who is the necessarily existent, ontologically independent, creative source of all else. Now, Morris acknowledges, there might be a problem here. Intuitions are not always universally shared. They are defeasible in some circumstances. They may need correction. So here is his solution to this. If we're doing perfect being theology and we are relying heavily on intuition, we recognize that that's a fallible method. So Morris says, well, the solution is you need some revelational control. Well, here again is where I'm saying he needs to be limiting himself to a concept of a Christian God. Otherwise, you're going to rely on various sources identified as revelation. And he's already referred to the Bible as the source of revelation, the Christian scriptures. And so what he says is we need a confluence of perfect being theology with method 4, which was a comprehensive explanatory theology, which itself was bringing together the explanatory theology and also biblical theology. And so he says that's the best route to resolve conflicting intuitions. If we have intuitions that conflict about the nature of God, we use those other methods. So he does have that kind of as a boundary over our perfect being theology, how, since it relies on intuitions and could be fallible, how we can make sure that we don't get messed up, cross the line in our description of God. So again, that now gives us a concept of a Christian God. So somebody who wants to talk about whether or not the Christian God exists, or the nature of the Christian God, or why would the Christian God allow evil, or any of those things, it's important to have in mind what exactly we're talking about. And this is Morris's idea.